whatever you're going to bring up in Final Focus should have been addressed somewhere else in the round.
Sounds good.
That's my biggest thing.
Sure. Awesome.
Sorry, I'm old school PF where like everything was okay until Final Focus.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. Whenever you're all ready.
Yeah, we're good to go. Right?
Oh yeah. Thank you.
Alright, is everyone ready? Highland affirms contention 1 is international legitimacy. Patrick from the Council on Foreign Relations in 2010 finds that a lack of geographic balance in the Security Council's permanent membership has eroded its authority, complicating the enforcement of its resolutions, and causing states to turn to other security frameworks. There are two ways that India's permanent seat reinstates the Security Council's legitimacy, and the first is through diversity. Mishra from the Indian Journal of Political Science in 2006 writes that the legitimacy of the United Nations Security Council will increase if third world security interests are represented in the body, as non-permanent membership is insufficient to address the constant threat of security in developing nations. Mishra finds that India's permanent status would uniquely work for the protection of third world security interests. The second is through amending the Charter. Any addition of member states to the Security Council would require an amendment to the UN Charter. Fortunately, Hosley from the University of Netherlands in 2017 finds that any amendment to the UN Charter would benefit the Council's ability to operate as an institution seen to be legitimate to maintain global security. By granting India permanent member status, the UN is reflected as a legitimate and adaptive institution. The impact is ineffective enforcement of resolutions. Hurd of Northwestern University in 2002 writes that the power of the Security Council depends on the voluntary cooperation of states, furthering that the power of the Council is measured in variables such as international enforcement of sanctions. Unfortunately, maintaining the status quo would dissolve the Council's legitimacy, causing states to disregard the Council's decisions. Empirically, this is true. Hurd finds that in 1992, the sanctions imposed by the Council in Libya were successfully delegitimized, causing sanctions to fail. Contention 2 is sidewinding the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is a Chinese policy made to reroute global trade back to China. Problematically, the Journal of Diplomacy in 2018 finds that due to their status on the Security Council, China has been able to coerce developing nations into massive loans, and when African countries are unable to sustain their high debt, they fall into a debt trap. There are two ways that China uses their current power in the Security Council to coerce African states into poor policies. Subpoint A is veto protection. Khalil from Harvard Law School in 2018 finds that underdeveloped nations align themselves with permanent members of the Security Council because they use veto power to protect their security interests. However, the Center for Strategic and International Studies elaborates that in 2018, China used its power in the Security Council to coerce South Sudan into an agreement for economic development, putting them into a debt trap. Fortunately, giving India a spot on the Security Council stops this. A permanent seat on the Security Council would allow Africa to align its interests with a trusted country that has equal power to represent matters of security. Mishra from the Indian Journal of Political Science in 2006 writes that India has demonstrated geostrategic interest in stabilizing African states. Subpoint B is repossessing peacekeeping efforts. Mampilly of Oxford University in 2018 reports that India has begun cancellation of multiple peacekeeping missions, and as the largest contributor to these efforts, India has left behind an enormous vacuum to fill. Worryingly, the USIP in 2018 highlights that China has stepped up to pursue their own financial interests. Beijing's current UN peacekeeping policies have helped China expand its debt trap diplomacy throughout the developing world, furthering its Belt and Road trade initiatives. Luckily, the Economic Times in 2018 finds that India is willing to reclaim the financial responsibilities of missions and expand the deployment of peacekeepers if given a permanent seat. The impact of both subpoints is starvation. The FCAC in 2011 contextualizes the effects of the BRI, finding that Chinese colonialist expansion in Africa has led to massive famines, causing 12 million people to starve. The only chance of giving African nations a trusted path away from poor diplomacy is to grant India a permanent seat. Contention 3 is sexual violence. Patrick from the Council on Foreign Relations in 2015 writes that the United Nations peacekeeping efforts have long had a dark side of exploitation and abuse against civilians. Al Jazeera in 2018 explains that this issue becomes widespread because of a hierarchy of men dominating the peacekeeping efforts. India solves this. According to the UN in 2013, India has broken the glass ceiling by enlisting the first all-female peacekeeping forces. They are also championing gender training and protection programs to protect against this kind of abuse. The impact is empowering women. The UN furthers that host countries reported of gender violence at a far higher rate with female peacekeepers, allowing action to be taken against the perpetrators. Thus, we affirm.
I see the all-female peacekeeping.
Yeah, absolutely.
And can I see the South Sudan example under veto protection?
South Sudan, yeah.
Could I also say that China's stepping up their peacekeeping?
Yeah, absolutely.
Doing it all three.
You want to grab the China one, and then I'll get South Sudan and.
China's upping peacekeeping, right?
Yes.
And how that affects that.
And so you said
How
you
that
wanted
works.
South Sudan, and what was the other one? Sorry.
On South Sudan example, I want to see the like all female.
Okay, so here's South Sudan, and then I'll get you the other one.
Okay. Where does it say that this was China dead diplomacy in South Sudan? It says economic cooperation, but specifically dead diplomacy.
It doesn't use the
Oh,
phrase.
right, right here. It's economic and technical cooperation deals. That's
No,
what,
I saw that, but where's it talking?
that's the BRI.
That's what it
That's
is.
that's the Belt and Road Initiative.
No, okay.
You can remember if you want. And then this is peacekeeping BRI. It's getting heated next door.
Going on.
Okay.
And this last one from the UN about the female peacekeeping efforts and the gender training.
All right.
All right. Okay, is anybody not ready? Alright, then I will begin. We indicate resolved. The United Nations should grant India permanent membership in the Security Council. Our sole contention is false promises. India's good deeds may not have been without the perception of gain. The moment India obtains a powerful position on the Security Council, they will no longer have the incentive to continue their overwhelmingly positive behavior. First is false promises of peace with Pakistan. India is only holding back from conflict in order to obtain a seat on the permanent seat on the council. Chawwan at the University of Hankook finds that with the permanent seat as the highest priority of Indian foreign policy, India has partaken in quiet diplomacy. He furthers that India has superior military power to Pakistan, yet they only defend against Pakistani invasions and have never invaded or attacked first. In fact, Chawwan concludes that whenever India has any conflicts with Pakistan, India has taken a short cool-down period and then returned to diplomatic policies to improve its relations with Pakistan. The impact is nuclear state conflict. Korb and Rothman explained that even a small skirmish between India and Pakistan could escalate into a nuclear conflict, as Pakistan announced it is testing a nuclear warhead designed to be used against invading troops. They conclude that even a limited nuclear war exchange could result in 3 million direct casualties and cause nuclear winters with devastating effects on agriculture. Ashgar 16 explains that even a limited nuclear conflict could lead to massive food shortages that would result in up to 2 billion in indirect casualties. Do not be quick to write off nuclear war as unlikely, as Witter 11 indicates that Pakistan has pledged to use nuclear weapons in case of a conflict escalation between itself and India. Witter cites crucial empirics from 1999 when conflict became very near to a widespread nuclear conflict. The second is false promises of African aid. Berry and ICA explained that over the last decade, the Indian government has taken great steps to strengthen ties with Africa. Consequently, Indian trade with African countries has increased fivefold. India has created various African development projects, and Indian loans to Africa have risen by $10 billion in the past. Sinha of the University of Birmingham writes that the lines of credit given to Africa by the Indian government have funded various development projects and served as a bridge to bring Indian private sector development to Africa. This production of capital in Africa helps the poorest in the world. Despite the seeming altruism of India's developments in Africa, Norla Kartin of the University of Cambridge writes that India is only willing to incur the cost of letting Africa free ride on Indian support in exchange for Africa's political support on the international stage. In fact, Calgared finds that India created these development initiatives in Africa to obtain a seat on the UN Security Council. Indeed, Norlikar finds that increasingly, India enhances ties with Africa to maintain an African coalition of support for its bid to the UNSC membership. Moreover, Sidropalas 11 of the Chatham House explains that India's engagement to Africa is driven by India's desire to prove it's capable of shouldering global responsibilities necessary for being a Security Council member. Affirming and granting India membership on the UNSC would reverse the trend of Indian support in Africa, obliterating decades of political development. Bureau of CSIS explains that without a strategic interest in Africa, India would much rather focus on regional diplomatic and economic issues that require extensive resources. Unfortunately, Taylor 12 of the Chatham House explains that as India's international standing increases, India's interests further diverge from those of Africa. Taylor confirms that India maintains no vested interest in Africa besides their own. Thus, Stunkel 10 of Harvard University concludes that upon gaining membership to the Security Council, India would shed its previously charitable display and end support for developing nations. The impact is reducing poverty. Kelborn of the University of South Africa writes, by promoting growth of the private sector and expanding the goods available at a 1% increase in domestic credit, empirically reduces poverty by 0.24%. Patanyaka 17 finds that one development project has already helped 15 million poor individuals in Africa, and India has committed to continuing these projects in the next 5 years, unless you affirm.
Can we see the card that says that they're only sending aid to Africa to get on the council?
Yeah, sure.
Sweet.
Which one? There are a couple. I can just give you.
I'm pretty
the
sure what
best.
you just like straight up read. They're only giving aid and loans to get the Security Council seat.
Yeah, whichever one's most explicit and clear. I did.
Alright. It's gonna be this one, sorry, right there.
Okay.
No. Okay, and then could we also do the one that says that they would cut aid if they didn't get the seat, or if they did get the seat? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. Look at that.
Alright, ready for cross?
Yeah. Let's do it. Sorry, let me just get my timer over.
Yeah, that's good. Alright. Alright,
You ready for the first
yeah,
question?
yeah.
Sweet. So on your contention one about it's all false promises on Pakistan. You
Yeah.
talk about a nuclear conflict, and then you read a card from 2011 that says that Pakistan's ready to go to nuclear war, right?
Well, yeah, since we say, yeah, like Pakistan has the capability to initiate nuclear war.
They have the capability. All right. Are any of their military leaders particularly hawkish or like ready to push the button?
I mean, like, I would argue, like, yes, it's pretty explicit. Like, the nuclear weapons are, like, for the deterrence of an invading force from India, a result from escalation.
Sure, but the person that just got elected in Pakistan, isn't he actually very anti-war and has essentially taken
Wait, but
off
didn't we
nuclear
just have,
weapons?
like, a major escalation in the conflict?
Sure, and we're going to argue that escalation is happening, but our argument is simply that your impact of nuclear war is infeasible or simply won't happen. Now that's because Pakistan just elected a new leader that is bringing peace talks to the table.
Okay, yeah, like, I'll call for that later.
Okay,
Question.
sweet, yeah, go for it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about, like, the Belt and Road Initiative, right?
Uh-huh.
So, do these countries, like, voluntarily take loans from China?
Yes, they do.
Okay, so if they're taking loans from China because they need the money, what changes?
It's not that they're getting money, and it's not that they necessarily need the money. What they need is protection.
Wait, but
from
what does
any
protection have
UNSC.
to do with accepting like loans, right? Because that's what debt diplomacy is. That's what the BRI is.
It's a deal to build better relations with China, right?
No, it's not better relations. It's infrastructure.
Right,
So
right,
if
but
they
taking these
need the
deals-
infrastructure, what changes?
If they need the infrastructure,
Yes, exactly,
Well,
right.
I-
Like,
I
the
think
reason they
they're-
built a port in Sri Lanka was because Sri Lanka needed a port.
but not really, because China repossessed the port and it absolutely damaged their economy, right? And these countries aren't like completely oblivious to this issue. It's happened in 3 countries now, and they keep seeing this. The thing is, the evidence that we read in our case says that even though countries see this like terrible economic things, they need the protection from the UNSC. And because China's the only one with a veto power that they
Wait.
trust, they have to go to China.
Wait, but you just told me the countries know what's going on. If that's the case, why do they trust China?
Why do they trust China? They have to. They have no other protection. For example, like it's like countries like South Sudan, they have corrupt governments. In order to protect their regimes from being sanctioned
Wait,
in the
but
UN,
what does
they
protecting
have
the
to make
regime
these
have to
deals.
do with like taking loans from China?
They take loans from China in exchange for protection in the UN Security Council.
Wait.
Do you mind if I
But the
have a question?
BRI, right, the Belt and Road Initiative, is to make like the new Silk Road, correct?
Right, yeah,
It
they're
is
expanding
trade
economic
networks
trade.
between China and other countries. So if these are trade networks, they're independent of like political clout.
That's
does
what
that
I'm
have
saying.
to
Is
do with
they're
protection?
absolutely not. I think it's naive to assume that China's only doing this for benefiting Africa and helping
I'm
their
not
own
talking about
economy.
what China wants. I'm talking about what the countries who receive the loans want.
Right, they want political protection. That's the evidence that we read you.
Okay, I would argue that's not true, but you can.
Okay, well, I mean, you can read that in the next speech, but like we give you good warranting for why. I think that's time. Actually.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know.
Can I see the evidence saying they go to, like, the reason they get debt diplomacy is for the vote buying or for
Yeah.
the veto protection?
I see the.
That wasn't the South Sudan card, right?
Right.
It gives another example of Zimbabwe as well. Alright, is it cool if he gets that to you?
I want to see it.
Well, can we do it after his speech?
I'd like to see it.
Okay, that's fine. You don't want a card.
Yeah, it was the same one, like it was CSIS.
Oh.
That's
It
the
was South Sudan.
Yeah, it is a
Yes,
South
it's
Sudan
South
card.
Or can I see it electronically?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alright.
Alright, is everyone ready? It's gonna start with a quick weighing overview at the top of their case and then just down. Alright. Is everyone ready? Alrighty. Let's start off with a quick weighing overview. Recognize that the first impact on our first contention is a prerequisite to all of our opponent's case. Because if the United Nations Security Council loses legitimacy, what Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, finds in 2013 is that they have at best 15 years before the legitimacy reduces to dangerous levels. The reason that this is so critical is because in this round, both of us are going to be talking about the legitimacy of the Security Council. But insofar as uniqueness controls the direction of the link, we are going to be controlling which way the legitimacy goes. We would argue that right now, because of things like less diversity and not being able to adapt towards the contemporary issues of the modern world, the United Nations Security Council has proven to be an unlegitimate institution, which is why it's really important that we continue to increase legitimacy. Insofar as the impact tells you that right now, because of in the 1990s, when legitimacy went down, countries like Libya were able to circumvent sanctions because they posed the decision made by the Council as illegitimate. That means that in their world in 15 years, when most of decisions by resolutions are seen as illegitimate, countries don't follow through on resolutions, and we end up with worse international security. With that in mind, go towards their sole contention, talking about false promises. Their first warrant here is about Pakistan and how there will be more conflict. First, the first thing they read you here is that India doesn't have an incentive to attack first. There's 2 problems here. The first one is that it's fundamentally non-unique. Evidence from 3 days ago from the Economic Times finds is that India put in cross-border military troops in order to increase conflict. That is the most post-dated card in the round. They're going to tell you that conflicts are de-escalating right now. But the second non-unique comes from the Washington Post that says that non-governmental organizations like anti-Indian terrorist organizations are increasing tensions right now. This is because of things like they tell you in Cross, like different attacks that happen inside of Kashmir. Right now, there are 2 fundamental reasons that the impact of conflict is going to be non-unique. But on top of that, recognize that the idea of a leader going to war is really improbable. As Jackson alludes to in Crossfile, Al Jazeera in 2018 finds that Prime Minister Khan, the newly elected Prime Minister of Pakistan, is the farthest thing from a warhead that has ever been in office inside of Pakistan. They find that after conflicts escalated and warplanes were shot down inside of Kashmir, instead of going towards conflict and threatening India, Prime Minister Khan actually actually took forward diplomatic initiatives to call for negotiations. That's a move that hasn't been done since 1971, since conflict has escalated. We would argue that conflict is the last thing that would happen between India and Pakistan. But finally, even if you don't buy any of this, you can turn the entire contention against them. Because right now, China is supporting Pakistan through the CPEC, or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which emboldens Pakistan to take on more conflicts. However, when you affirm the resolution, you fiat that China doesn't veto India's acceptance into the Security Council, which means that Pakistan sees China as a betrayer and is no longer emboldened to take on conflicts. Only in our world do we see that Pakistan is no longer emboldened, if in any way, shape, or form they would be. Let's go on to their second link, talking about African aid. They tell you that India is increasing a lot of aid and they're doing it all for themselves. The problem is not a single card that they handed us says that they would stop supporting aid in the status quo if they got a permanent seat. All it says is that they're doing it to make the international community seem like they are good. And that links into our first warrant, which is why secondly you can turn the argument against them. By increasing India onto the Security Council, you represent diversity, which is what they're doing right now. It's just extended if you affirm the resolution because you allow India to expand that influence throughout the Security Council. But secondly, more importantly, the most important turn in the round is going to be recognizing that India and China are both going to be giving loans towards Africa. We both agree on that. However, in our world, it's better for two reasons. The first one is because in our world, 12 million people are not starving from famine. In their world, when China is able to take these deals and coerce South Sudan and Zimbabwe into economic cooperative deals because of the Belt and Road Initiative, they have the ability to cause resource shortages and put 12 million into starvation as they have right now. Whereas in my opponent's case, they tell you that India's loans are the best thing that has ever happened to Africa. They're actually in African interest, and they're actually doing things to benefit infrastructure. But the second and most important one is that they're going to come up here and tell you that right now, India is going to be pulling out of all these deals. The problem is that recognize that even if India were to pull out of these deals, they still represent Africa with security interests, something that China is not doing right now, and even if they are, they're doing it at the cost of starvation. Thus, we strongly urge an affirmative ballot.
Sorry. I'll take that. It's going to be responding to rebuttal, then down their case.
So frontline first, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Everybody good? Okay. First, let's start with their weighing. They say that legitimacy is going to pre-rec both cases. That's not really the case considering neither of our links rely on the UNSC effectiveness whatsoever. Doesn't really apply to our case. So let's get on to our first warrant about Pakistan. It reads you a lot of non-uniques, which we're going to concede to, that takes out his term. We would agree conflict can escalate no matter what because India is being aggressive. That doesn't matter. Now on to our second warrant about African abandonment. He say that none of our evidence says it doesn't stop. But what the Bureau evidence tells you is that if India no longer sees a strategic interest in offering the loans to Africa, they will focus on domestic issues and domestic development rather than African development. The reason and the interest that they have in funding Africa is to get on the UN Security Council. Once they're on the Security Council, there is no strategic interest, and that's when they focus on their own domestic policy, and that's why Stone concludes that after they get onto the UNSC, they would stop funding Africa, which this means is that all the African loans go away. And then they turn says they the terms don't make sense because it's not in their case actually. On to their first condition about legitimacy. On the first one about diversity, they think you can turn this because the African argument is going to cause us to go the other way. Because if India gets on the council and then it's seen as abandoning African countries because they use all the African countries to gain support to get onto the council and then suddenly abandon them, if anything, that signals to African countries that the UN is actually even more against them than it was before, and decreasing legitimacy and decreasing diversity. But that means they're only even less likely to comply because they were just used and abused to get onto the council and thrown away because they're no longer important. But then second, on amending the charter, the charter amendments can be vetoed by the P5. The Economic Times explains that China will always oppose UN reform, which means the charter will never be amended. And next, there's literally no impact onto the decrease in legitimacy. They're incredibly vague. They say it'll get to dangerous levels of legitimacy decreases at a point. They never say what this means. It's way too late in the round. Legitimacy is not. There's no impact on the argument. Don't let them go for it. On to the second contention about China. It's what they're really going to go for. On to the first warrant about veto protection. They read this evidence saying that countries go to China for economic and for debt diplomacy because they want the veto protection. That's not what the evidence says. It says South Sudan signed an agreement with China for like economic cooperation, and later China vetoed a couple of things that would go against South Sudan. But the reason that these countries get diplomacy from China is because they want development and they want it's actually voluntary on their part. There's 4 other countries they could choose from the P5 that could do vote buying from them. They're all economic powerhouses, but they made a strategic calculus to choose China, even knowing that China is also very, very predatory. So that means that these countries who are voluntarily taking diplomacy and voluntarily taking the loans think that it is their economic interest to take from China. That's never going to change. And even so, even if they win, that China is very predatory and these countries would stop, the only way they get offense is they prove that India replaces China. But that means they have to win our second contention before they can even win their contention, because if India doesn't replace them, then China's going to continue no matter what. Then also the argument about peacekeeping. Still, this relies on the fact that China's going to that India's going to replace them. But I would argue that once India gets onto the Security Council, they no longer care about the African countries, because the only reason they are even talking to them and allying with them is so they can gain the legitimacy to get on the council in the first place. At that point, we're going to be linking into starvation impact even better than they do. Now, on to the third contention about sexual violence. The evidence is from 2013. It says that 100 women are taking part in this training. There's only a 4 group. This is a really small scale. There hasn't been any development since 2013. I would argue this is like a small scale thing that isn't actually being happening on a widespread, because there's hundreds of thousands of UN peacekeepers. That's very small scale. That's not what's actually happening. And the vast majority of Indian peacekeepers are still men, because you're still going to be seeing all the sexual violence. And if anything, the impact is going to be very small scale. You can mitigate it heavily. But we can really do the easy weighing is on our second argument about African abandonment. So it's going to take out the links to a lot of their cases. First, we would say that right now, India funds Africa through loans because they think that is the best way to get them onto the Security Council, because they know they need the support of the African nations to get them the ultimate political capital to get on. But once they are there, the Bureau evidence is really clear in telling you that they would ultimately shift to domestic policies rather than focusing on Africa, because once they have the legitimacy they want, they no longer need Africa. When that happens, African countries feel like they were abandoned after they were used to get on the council, so that means the legitimacy goes down, but also it means that no one fills in for Chinese loans, which means there's never going to be an increase in Chinese loans. All you see is that Indian loans go away and that countries are worse off. Ready for cross?
Yeah, you want to start off?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to your second warrant, right? So you say that India is going to pull out, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so right now, when India puts loans and they put aid into Africa, what do they get in return?
Here. The analysis evidence says that they are akin to free rides, and they actually give out a lot more than they get in, because what they see is that their ultimate goal, their main foreign policy objective overall in India, is to get on the Security Council. That's why they're willing to incur the cost of this free ride in the short term, because they think that getting on the Security Council will be really good for them in the long term.
Okay, what does it do towards it? Does it damage India for doing all this? Like, does it hurt their economy?
Probably, yeah. And that's why they're not.
Probably, or like, does it?
It's like there's no net benefit to them.
Well, here's what I'm trying to get at, right? Like, right now, India is giving loans towards African states in order to get on the seat, right? So for them to maintain legitimacy on that seat and have other states follow their past resolutions or proposed resolutions, don't they still have to represent the same interests?
No, because once they have the power of the permanent seat, they no longer need that interest, because there's always going to be the rotation of the non-permanent members, but the veto power and having the power of the permanent seat is all that they care about.
So why do African states trust China right now? Why do they trust China right now?
I mean, because China gives them loans, but like you said,
right,
they're predatory,
exactly.
They probably don't.
Like, they're giving them loans, right? So China is able to utilize Africa's support in the Security Council for legitimacy, which is why China is successful in the Security Council.
But that's because
who is
China
also
has the
providing
larger
loans,
Belt and Road Initiative that India doesn't. India's
right,
like, oh, wait,
but
no,
China is pushing people into famine. India is not. So couldn't you argue that India is fundamentally better for China? Because China doesn't want people starving in their country. They'd rather have the loans and the economic infrastructure development without the harms of things like famine.
What's your point?
My point is that your link is the idea that like they're going to pull out because they don't need to sustain legitimacy. But like the idea that like right now what's happening in the status quo is that China is supporting Africa with loans in order to support them and get legitimacy on the council is the same thing that would happen with India. There's no reason that India would get on the council and just say like
China's loans are a net positive for them because they're far more predatory and they can take advantage of the territory. That's what they want. They want to build infrastructure and then seize the infrastructure when people can't pay it back.
Right.
India's aren't like that. That's why China's are more beneficial for them than India's are. So India's are a free ride. China is predatory. That's the issue.
But why does that mean that India pulls out?
Because they're not advantageous for India like they are for China. The evidence is super clear on saying they incur the cost of the free ride because they get the legitimacy. But the legitimacy is their ultimate objective.
Well, that's a conclusion your evidence just does not make. Your
evidence
evidence
call
says,
for that evidence.
Yeah, we did. And it says that India has a strategic interest in giving loans to Africa to get a seat. It does not say that after India gets a seat, they lose their strategic interest. Because India's total strategic interest is to have legitimacy and influence in the Afro-Asian region. They only get get
No,
that
no.
when they have the support
China's
of African
India's
states.
overarching foreign policy objective is the Security Council seat. That is what they want more than anything. The African
Right, but why do they want that?
wait. The African cooperation is a means
Right.
to an end.
Right, why do they want the seat though?
Because
They want influence over the Afro-Asian region. They want more influence over the
They
entire...
want the concrete influence that comes with the seat, but once they have the seat, they no longer need that background legitimacy.
Okay, we will start our prep now. Okay, stop there. 8.
Seconds left?
7 seconds.
Alright, so it's going to start off on my opponent's case, on the neg, and then over to our case for front writing. Is everyone ready? Alright, time would work. Alright. On their contention to about African aid, number one, they say that there's no strategic reason for India to continue these loans so it doesn't happen. Keep in mind that number one, their card does not say that India will end these loans, but on top of that, Arunab finds a hole in cross-ex where he explains that there's actually economic and influential reasons. India wants the influence over the African region, and at that point, they have a strategic reason to keep giving these loans. Then they drop two huge turns on Africa. First is that we're already expanding peacekeeping. Now they claim that India is only doing all these good things in order to get on the council. But keep in mind the evidence that we read on our contention 3 that says that they are willing to expand peacekeeping efforts if they get on the council. That's something good that they would do after they get on the council. They're not just saying that. Then you can extend the second turn. It says that they both give loans. China and India both give loans. The difference is which world you're living in. In the affirmative world, you have a place where there's not massive famines, then we're creating a mutually beneficial partnership. China doesn't do that. Then on to our case. On contention 1 about legitimacy, they say that if they win Africa, they win this. That's fine, we're winning Africa. Then on the second link about amendment, they say that amendments could be vetoed by P5 members. Keep in mind that we fiat through this. As long as you pass the resolution, it causes the amendment to happen because you have to amend the charter to add another member. Then they say that we have no impact. That's not true. It comes from voluntary cooperation, which we're very explicit about. It says that sanctions can't be imposed if countries don't believe in the UNSC. That's why we need legitimacy, which is going away in 15 years. It's really critical when we talk about things like North Korea or the genocide happening in Myanmar. If we can't condemn those things, then we can't create peace. Then on our contention 2 about the BRI, kick the first link. And then go for the second link. They talk about peacekeeping. They say that we have to win Africa. That's not true. Peacekeeping, India already controlled, but they seceded to China because they didn't get a seat on the Security Council. Keep in mind that they said that they would reclaim the financial responsibilities of peacekeeping missions, which stops China from spreading their death trap diplomacy. That's why you can extend the unique link of stopping 12 million people starving. Finally, on our contention 3 about sexual violence, they say that it's happening on too small of a scale. Understand that India is the largest peacekeeping organization, and they're setting a precedent. It's a grassroots movement that if you vote for the negative is never allowed to expand. Thus, we affirm.
Okay, we're gonna take prep. Alright, let's prep.
So the order is going to be starting off on the con, then moving to the pro. All right. Is everybody ready? All right. Let's start with the argument of African aid. What they tell you is that it's not actually going to end because there are other reasons they're doing it. But the really big problem here is very explicit when they tell you that the reason why they're actually going to stop pulling out is because there are other regional issues that require resources. But right now, most of that's being diverted to Africa. But the problem is they really only want them to have the influence on the seat. They tell you they do it for influence. We completely agree. But the influence stops the minute they join the council, because at the point when they're a member on the council, a permanent member, they no longer need the support. A lot of the permanent members right now don't have popular support from these developing nations, but they still have the exact same amount of power. And he understands this. But the other really big problem here is what I would tell you is that what happens is when they become a permanent member, they actually stop representing the intentions of the developing nations, and they can no longer effectively lead, and they still lose legitimacy because ultimately to become one of the global elites the minute they join them, and at that point they're no longer representing the interests of the developing world because they're no longer on the same standing. They don't have the same interest anymore. They try to turn this by saying that peacekeeping expands, they're already expanding peacekeeping on the council. It doesn't really make any sense at the point where the loans are pulled out. They say both the worlds give loans. This also doesn't make any sense at the point where once India stops giving loans, the only people giving loans are China. It's net worse in their world because the millions of dollars in aid are going to Africa right now are going to go away. That's really bad because we tell you that one project alone is helping 15 million people, and if you increase if you continue these, you get a 0.24% reduction in poverty. That's really good. You're helping millions. That's the biggest impact of the round. It's going to be helping more Africans in our world. But let's go over their case. They say a few things. On their first condition, what they talk about the impact is you can't effectively sanction because you lose legitimacy. This doesn't make any sense at all. They clearly don't know what sanctions even are. Sanctions are imposed by the countries who want to impose these sanctions. The US can still impose sanctions. Russia can still impose sanctions. You don't have to agree to a sanction. You're just sanctioned. That's how it works. Next, go on to their attention about BRI. Once again, they make a really critical mistake. They go for peacekeepers. The problem here is they never actually tell you how peacekeeping stops debt diplomacy. That's really big because that means you can't actually vote for them and they have no offense in the round. Even if you don't buy our offense, you still presume neg because they have no offense. Really specifically, the reason why they don't give you a warrant is because the warrant isn't actually true. The reason these countries take loans from China is because they need the economic benefit. That is the only reason they do it. That's the reason why the Belt and Road Initiative exists, is to create economic and infrastructure in these countries. That doesn't stop in their world. They have no offense.
Ready for cross?
Yeah, do you mind if we start off actually?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. So, let's go to this idea of peacekeeping, right?
Yeah.
So you say that so you said that peacekeeping isn't replaced, or I'm sorry, I just didn't get your response on peacekeeping.
Yeah, so essentially, the main response is that there's no warrant for why peacekeeping stops debt diplomacy.
Right, Jackson, you want to explain that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. So essentially the evidence that we read from the very first speech in this round says that China is able to spread their influence when they control the majority of peacekeeping efforts. When they're sending Chinese people out into these African countries, they're spreading their influence, and that's exactly what they've been doing. In fact, the card directly says, it gives a warrant, it says that China is funding peacekeeping solely to expand their BDI.
No, okay, but we're asking is
BRI.
how does India increasing their peacekeeping operations stop China from giving out loans? Because I didn't get that articulation.
How
So, those seem entirely different. It's not even related
Oh,
things.
right. So the reason why comes from the Economic Times that says that right now India is cutting back because they don't have the seat. So in order for China to once again advance its initiatives, they're looking at that vacuum and filling it in.
No.
We
I'm
understand that.
asking why India increasing their peacekeeping stops China from giving out a loan.
It's not.
The loans are what harmful about the debt diplomacy. That is what makes it bad.
So
Yeah.
additional countries don't take these loans because there's not
But here's the
peacekeepers from
problem.
China.
You
from China.
already agreed earlier in this round that the loans are completely voluntary, right?
Right,
So
that's
at the
fine.
core
We're
of these
saying,
countries are
we're saying
taking
that
the
through
loans
peacekeeping,
for
China is able to
economic,
spread their
your own
influence.
evidence mentions it's for economic and tactical
Right,
purposes.
we're not going to
The
argue
point
that
where that
China's
is for-
forcing
Wait, no,
loans
no,
down their
no.
throat. It's the idea that they send out diplomats in order to
Wait, but
coerce.
peacekeepers are not diplomats. Peacekeepers are sent on missions for very specific purposes.
No, but the evidence that we give you says that they're spreading the influence as well.
Exactly.
No, peacekeepers are soldiers. They're not diplomats. And even so, okay, how does increasing peacekeepers stop China from giving a loan to a person who wants to build a port? Sri Lanka wanted to build a port. An increase in Indian peacekeepers would not have satisfied their need for a port. Those do not relate. No matter what, these countries will always want the loans to build infrastructure, which is what the Chinese loans are for.
And you give that argument too. India is giving those loans right now. Loans happen in both worlds. The argument is that our loans are better than yours because in your world there's starvation
your
happening.
Loans don't have uniqueness. You didn't tell me why peacekeepers stopped Chinese loans.
Right. So no. The uniqueness is that right now in your world, your entire argument is that now India is giving loans and so is China. In our world, India amps up loans because now they want to expand Afro-Asian interests, and then they represent the majority of the African Union with their veto power and with peacekeeping.
Where was that?
Yeah. Isn't that
I've
more
never
of
heard
your
that.
first point of diversity that you kicked?
No, that's 1, the first warrant on C1, and subpoint B on C2.
Like, yeah, I would agree.
No,
it's
never
like
do
C1.
you make the argument that that Africa India increases loans. All you say is increase peace.
Or not loans, but like the point still stands that China's loans are not going to be taken at a higher
Wait, but if
propensity as
peacekeepers
India's
have
are.
like sexually abuse people, how does that like look good on the country that's sending them?
That's C3.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
okay. We'll start the last couple of things. Alright. Alrighty. It'll start with the quick weighing overview that was in my rebuttal, then neg, and af, then voters. Alright. Is everyone ready? The only thing that they say to the overview is that we don't understand how sanctions work. The problem is they're overblowing the impact. What we tell you is that when the Security Council becomes less legitimate in the worldly negative, that's when countries look towards sanctions that are being posed by the Security Council, like they did in 1992, and view them as illegitimate as well. Which means that when the Security Council calls on a country to be sanctioned, yes, U.S. can sanction them independently, and so can Russia. But at the point where the Security Council calls on all countries to sanction them, which is what they do, that's when countries do not follow through with the sanctions. That's where voluntary compliance doesn't happen, and that's when you see the ineffectiveness of the Security Council. With that in mind, their only piece of offense left in this round is on Africa getting aid from India. The problem is they dropped 2 turns, and the terminal defense on their case do not let them extend it anymore. First, they tell you that India only wants the seat and are going to take away the aid when they get it, but they don't respond to the logic that tells you that right now, India wants to expand Afro-Asian interests. They're not going to be able to do that by my opponent's logic, because in the world where India gets a permanent seat, influence from Afro-Asia is not conditional. It's not permanent. It is conditional because Afro-Asia can always take away its influence and stop supporting India's permanent seat. But India wants complete influence over the entire region, which means that they have to continue to appease Afro-Asian states in order to continue to get that influence. That means the only world in which there is a non-harmful method of loans is in the world of the affirmative, because in their world you have things like starvation happening, but in our world you have things like Afro-Asian interests, which do not cause people to go into famine. With that in mind, there are 2 critical voters on our case that win us the ballot. The first one is on peacekeeping on the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the only thing they say is that right now, we're not telling like how much peacekeeping is going to go up by. The idea is that the idea is right now China is expanding influence with peacekeepers. They don't have to be diplomats to expand China's influence, but India is fundamentally better because right now China is like expanding influence for poor initiatives, but as they themselves tell you, India would do it in a better way. They give us the link towards our contention and give us solvency there. But then on C3, the most undercovered argument in the round by them, they only say that 2013 is a low skill, but recognize China is literally firing 2,000 sexual assault like investigators, and India is training people for gender orientation and things like that. In the world of the affirmative, things like peacekeeping get much better. Thus, we affirm.
All right, we'll take our rest.
Okay. It's gonna be their case and our case. I guess it'll be the weighing thing, then peacekeeping, then African abandonment. Everybody good?
Yeah.
Cool. On the weighing, he says that UNSC sanctions won't be able to comply with, but never once they tell you why UN sanctions matter. At that point, there's no relevance here. Let's get on to this peacekeeping argument. This argument is atrocious. They say that India increasing their peacekeepers stops Chinese loans. That doesn't make sense. Sri Lanka took a loan from China to build a port. How does India giving more peacekeepers, more soldiers, solve the need for that port? That doesn't make sense whatsoever. They still need to prove that the countries who get the loans for economic interest to build economic infrastructure are satisfied by Indian soldiers. That doesn't make any sense. This link has no contextualization. It is a terrible link. You cannot vote on it. How does that link into suddenly getting rid of the starvation? Because that only comes from getting rid of Chinese loans. But China still has an incentive to give out loans, even if India is sitting out peacekeepers, because China will always want to give out the loans, and countries still need the loans. That's why they take them in the first place. This link has no impact. Now, on the third contention, they also don't extend an impact on the sexual assault. Now, onto our case. Now, they say they continue to extend terms that aren't terms. They say that India wants Afro-Asian interests. But the problem is, what we tell you is the Afro-Asian interest is a means to an end, not the goal in and of itself. They want Afro-Asian interests so they can get onto the Security Council. But what Will tells you in summary really brilliantly is the very evidence tells you that they want the support because they want to get on the Security Council. But the reason they do so is that's their ultimate security or their ultimate foreign policy objective. But once they're on the P5, they no longer need the support because every P5 member doesn't have support from Afro and Asia. All they need, because once they're on the P5, it can't go be undone. Even if like he says, Their support is conditional. That doesn't mean that their power is conditional, because once you're on the P5, you have the power and it can't be taken back. And that's why we say that once they have their objective, they no longer need to give out African loans, and since it's a net negative for India, they stop doing so. That's really critical, because just one of these loan projects has helped 15 million people escape poverty, and once they all go away, we see mass increases in poverty within the country. They don't give you any weighing, so if anything, you can use their own starvation impacts against them, because it means all we have now are Chinese loans, not India loans, and it gets much worse. They don't have a link. You need to vote for the only link in the round, and that's on African abandonment.
Good round.
Good round, guys.
Nice job.
Good round.